Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at the Clinton School, and thank you, Allie, for that wonderful introduction. As Allie mentioned in the introduction, I attended and graduated from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So for me, it's a real pleasure to be here at the Clinton School of Public Service, which is very much involved in the same kind of educational mission as the LBJ School. When I went to the LBJ School now many years ago, I got interested in technology policy, and really I was inspired by a professor who's since passed away, a woman by the name of Susan Haddon. And Susan was just one of the more interesting people you could encounter. She was teaching at a public policy school. She had an undergraduate degree in Sanskrit from Harvard, and then she went off to get a PhD in political theory at the University of Chicago. And here she was, not being a practicing academic political theorist, but somebody interested in the practical application of some of that line of thinking to public problems. And Susan got involved with technology policy in a roundabout way, in that she was tasked with a project to figure out a public notice system in, I think, East Texas to help inform people about possible hazardous waste problems. So if a train was coming through some part of East Texas and there was a derailment, the challenge was how do you get the word out to people. And it occurred to her as she started to do this work, and this is roughly 1990 when technology was starting to become a greater part of people's daily lives. It occurred to her that if you want to get the word out to people, they have to be connected to information networks. The challenge circa 1990 was still, to some extent, how to get people connected by telephones. There were lots of, particularly rural areas in Texas, where there were low telephone take-up rates. Oftentimes, in these environmental situations, particularly with hazardous materials on rails, railroads would go through poor parts of town where telephone penetration was lower. So she started to scratch her quite intelligent head to think about, well, if we want to solve one problem, how do we encourage access to public safety information? We have to solve an upstream problem of access for citizens. So Susan became interested in that, and as somebody sitting in her class, I in turn got interested in that myself. And as Allie said in her introduction, I've been spending a lot of time in my career thinking about issues pertaining to information technology, access, and equity. Let me start out with a couple of questions for the audience. How many of you still have landline telephones in your house? How many people are just cell phone only? How many people have smartphones, whether it's an iPhone, Android? Just about everybody. Here's a question that's going to be perhaps more challenging. Allie can't answer because she learned it back there. What do you think the penetration rate for broadband at home is in the United States today? What share of households have subscriptions to a broadband internet service in the United States? 40%? 58? 30? That's very good, because in 2009 the figure was 63.5. Today it's about 70%. That's a great question, and I'll keep the answer short. In surveys, you ask people questions that you hope they can answer, obviously. In the survey business, which I've been involved with for a long time, essay questions are verboten. But you ask people whether they have high-speed internet connection at home. It actually usually takes a couple of questions. It starts with, do you use the internet? And that takes some careful framing of the question, and that usually goes something like, do you log on to the internet to surf the World Wide Web or check email? You want to put what World Wide Web and email in the same sentence, because sometimes people just use email, and if you just said World Wide Web, they wouldn't put it together. And then you start to ask people what kind of technology they have, which is little bit dicey. But you do a series of questions to get whether people have something that's essentially high speed and always on. You ask them if they have dial-up. You actually sometimes ask a couple questions to make sure that if they think they have dial-up, it's really dial-up. So you sort of do a couple questions, some questions on elimination to pin down whether they have dial-up or not, and then ask them whether they have broadband at home. You don't, in surveys, ask people or get reliable answers on what speed your broadband connection is, but between telephone surveys that I did a long time at the Pew Research Center and a good bit since, and what the Census Bureau does with questions of individual households, when they actually go face-to-face at households, we feel fairly comfortable that the number in the U.S. today is about 70%. Now, for Arkansas, according to the latest data from the Census Bureau, which is 2011, at which time 69% of Americans had broadband at home. Let me go to my cheat sheet. The number for Arkansas, I think, was 59.9%. So Arkansas trails the national average somewhat. A good bit of that more than likely has to do with the larger than average rural population in Arkansas relative to other parts of the country. The good news is, even though Arkansas trails the national average, it's been closing the gap in the past couple of years. It trailed by a greater margin in broadband adoption 3 or 4 years ago, so more and more people are starting to get online with broadband. So we have, roughly 2/3, maybe a little more, of America with broadband at home, and that means you have about 30% without broadband at home. Before I turn to some other issues, let me also frame the broadband adoption challenge a little differently than we had to frame it even 4 years ago when we developed the National Broadband Plan. 4 years ago, people, at least at the policy level, didn't think too much or care too much about smartphones. 4 years ago, when we were starting work on the National Broadband Plan, probably about 1 in 7 Americans had smartphones. Any takers on what share of the adult population has smartphones today? In the U.S. Sorry? 70%? See, so the crowd was low on home broadband adoption, a little too high on smartphones. 56%. So, smartphones are pretty darn powerful tools. You get always-on access at speeds that are clearly greater than dial-up. If you have 4G, you're surfing at speeds that are a lot faster than wireline broadband was 6 or 8 years ago. So policymakers are starting to glue smartphone adoption on top of broadband adoption. And when you start to do that, everybody here who has a smartphone almost certainly has a broadband internet connection at home, a subscription of some sort to either your cable provider or your telephone company. There is a segment of the population who, of that 30% of Americans who don't have broadband, there's a segment who have smartphones. They are smartphone-only internet users, meaning that their principal source of online access is only on a smartphone, as opposed to what probably most of us here enjoy, which is both broadband subscription at home and a smartphone. So when you add those, that section of the population into the mix, you get 80% of Americans having what I call advanced internet access, which is either broadband at home or the 10% who have smartphone only. So clearly we have more access to the tools of information technology than ever before, but there's still significant gaps. Gaps in terms of home broadband adoption, gaps even when you include the broader definition of advanced internet access when you get 20% of America who's disconnected. So the questions I want to touch on today with that kind of stage setting is, why is broadband policy important? When I work in Washington, and you often get the general sense that everything's terrific when it comes to the broadband marketplace. Now, again, there's disagreement on how terrific is, but there is a significant segment of the policy discussion that says everything's terrific with broadband. We don't have to do much additionally from a policy perspective to move the ball forward. And in fact, oftentimes that's an argument for regulatory pullback to do less in terms of regulation on the rationale that less regulation will promote more investment. So when you start to think about broadband policy, I think it is important to retreat to first principles and ask, why is broadband policy important? And I'm going to go through a couple of different reasons why I think it is important and will continue to be an issue that policymakers focus on. Number one, networks are social. At the Pew Internet Project where I worked, my former boss, Lee Rainey, had released a book last year called Networked. And that book talks a lot about how social this medium is. People love, if you ask people in surveys why they want to, or what the favorite thing they do online is, what the most important kind of use of the internet is, typically the answer is they like to connect with family and friends. 10 years ago, or 12 years ago when I first got into this business, that usually meant email or listservs. Today, it's about social networking in addition to email, Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. So networks are inherently social, and that's going to bring the issue of broadband into the public eye. They also create external benefits. I don't know how many students are here, but has anybody ever encountered the phrase network externalities in any of people's wanderings? Ooh, so I get to, anytime a PhD can deliver a new concept to someone, you feel like you're having a really good day. Network externalities is a pretty simple concept. If Marie and Allie want to communicate with one another and set up a network to do it, or just run a telephone line between them, it's great. They can communicate to their heart's content. If the gentleman to Marie's left wants to connect, he can connect, and they can start all talking. As more and more people connect, the network itself becomes more beneficial. More people on means there's more opportunity for interaction, and that means that there are going to be external benefits to connecting even more people to the internet or any kind of information network. And these network externalities typically mean that there could be rationales for public investment in them, because some of these benefits are external to the price system or to the market mechanism. Those benefits won't be captured by prices and profits from the private sector, which means there'd be underinvestment in networks unless there were perhaps some other kinds of support for building them and getting more people online. The other reason that broadband is bound to stay in the public eye as a public policy question is its basic infrastructure. In this country, infrastructure, whether it's electricity, waters and sewers, typically has some sort of public interest dimension to it. The same is bound to be the case going forward, as it has been in the past with information networks. Is anybody familiar with the term common carriage? If any of you have learned anything or encountered telephone regulation over the years, common carriage is the principle that dates back centuries that says that anybody should be able to connect to a network if they pay the going rate. So if in the history of the telephone, the fact that it was legally classified as common carriage meant that if AT&T built a network, it was obligated to connect either individuals or other networks to it, as long as the parties could work out the right payment scheme. They couldn't discriminate and say, no, your network isn't going to connect to mine. There's actually a lot of debate these days whether broadband should be considered common carriage. In fact, on the basis of, I think, a 2004 FCC decision, broadband networks, whether they're run by telephone companies or run by cable companies, are not classified as common carriers. Yet there has been, over the past decade, both a policy consensus, but also lots of policy disputes over the notion that broadband networks should be open to all comers if they can pay the fee. That's known either as the Open Internet Order, which the FCC put out in 2010, or it also comes under the banner of network neutrality, which is to say that the principle of network neutrality essentially says that users should be able to access any lawful content on the internet without an intermediary like the internet service provider discriminating on the access to that content. So for those reasons, openness, common carriage, the fact that the internet is infrastructure, broadband policy is going to be important going forward. The second reason why broadband policy is important and likely not to fade into the sunset is that networks require public consent and use public assets in order to be built. So if you're thinking about wireline internet provided either by the telephone company or a cable company, those companies have to get access to public rights of way, the utility poles in the streets, perhaps digging trenches in street in order to run their network. That requires them to get access to public assets, and therefore it's going to be a public policy issue, in this case very much at the state or even more crucially local level. The other issue is spectrum. I saw the show of hands. There's a vast majority of people here who have smartphones, and if you don't have a smartphone, more likely you have a cell phone. It requires electromagnetic spectrum in order to connect those devices to information networks. And spectrum is a publicly owned asset. And the government is the entity that allocates spectrum to various carriers under various conditions. One recommendation that came out of the National Broadband Plan was the notion was the finding that this country is going to have to let a lot more spectrum become available for the commercial marketplace over the coming years in order to meet the demand for data. I mean, when you start surfing the internet on your smartphone or watching video on a smartphone, you are using, you're putting a lot of stress from a data perspective on networks because you're just downloading a lot of information. So the National Broadband Plan said that the U.S. should make available 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next 10 years in order to meet these demands. And it suggested two ways, or recommended two ways to go about doing that. One is lots of spectrum in the marketplace is controlled by Uncle Sam. The federal government has access to lots of spectrum. A lot of it is in the hands of the Defense Department for security reasons. The idea, and this is something that the Commerce Department is in the process of working on, is to try to figure out ways to get some of that spectrum from government hands into the private sector, or find ways from a technical perspective to share that spectrum. If you look at the assets, the spectrum assets that the Defense Department has, and you did test to see what the percentage utilization of Defense Department spectrum is at any given time, it's on the order of single-digit percentage points. So for the most part, over 90% of the time, spectrum that is in the hands of the Defense Department is not in use by the Defense Department. So the idea is to figure out ways to share some of that spectrum or get some of that spectrum that really isn't crucial to the Defense Department into the commercial marketplace. So spectrum is important, crucially important to the companies that we rely on for our services, and the process of unleashing spectrum is very much a public policy question. The other recommendation on spectrum from the broadband plan has to do with incentive auctions. When the TV networks were given spectrum over 60 years ago to provide broadcast TV, they were given lots of spectrum. Why? Because at the time, in order to broadcast television, it was necessary to have huge amounts of spectrum in order to get pictures to people's homes at the quality that the people wanted. Today, these broadcast networks still control lots of the spectrum, but through advances in technology, with the advent of digital TV, there are far more efficient ways to broadcast television that take up far less spectrum that these companies have been allocated. So there's an opportunity to move spectrum which is allocated to broadcasters to better uses. And the idea behind incentive auctions is to essentially bribe broadcasters into selling some of their spectrum. And by that, I mean incentive auctions incentive auctions aren't scheduled to take place till 2014 or 15. But if you're a broadcaster and you decide you want to participate in the incentive auction process, the broadcaster essentially is going to say, okay, I'm going to put some of my auction, I'm essentially going to give back some of my spectrum to the federal government. The federal government will then auction it to the private sector for commercial use. A percentage of the proceeds from that auction will then go back to the broadcaster to compensate, basically, and that's the bribe part, essentially to give them incentive to participate in the auction in the first place. So incentive auction is our public policy matters that will be before the Federal Communications Commission over the next year or so to devise the rules for these incentive auctions. I just did sort of a sketchy overview of, well, I hope it's not sketchy, but a sketch of the incentive auction process. Actually conducting these incentive auctions requires rather detailed planning from a technical perspective and from an economics perspective to figure out the rules for the auction. So those will be big issues for policymakers in the coming years. The third reason that broadband policy will continue to be important is because essentially the notion of path dependence. We've had regulation in the communications sphere for over 70 years. You just don't dismantle regulatory structures overnight. A number of rhythms and issues are bound to reoccur. For instance, we've had this sort of rhythm in the world of telecom regulation over the years whereby there's a regulatory regime that comes into place to respond to a new technology. 60 or 70 years ago, that new technology was telephone. A regulatory apparatus builds up around that. That apparatus and the business models that adhere with that apparatus usually get disrupted because of innovation. In the case of the telephone, microwave technology in the 1960s upended the AT&T monopoly. So regulation had to adapt. Regulation also typically helps entrants get a stronger foothold into a new market. So in the case of AT&T in the 1960s and 70s, that AT&T, then a very different company than the AT&T of today, essentially tried to use regulation to block new entrants into the market for long-distance service. They were successful in getting regulators to agree with them for a while, but eventually regulators sort of got the clue, relaxed some of the protectionist regulatory regulations that AT&T had relied upon, and new entrants to the marketplace could thrive, MCI, other kinds of companies. It's also the case that as innovation occurs that disrupts the established regime, the innovation itself oftentimes is finds itself, the seeds of innovation oftentimes come from government-funded research and development. A couple of examples of that. Does anybody think that Apple was founded on the backs of government innovation and research? It was. I mean, obviously, you had the brilliance and tenacity of Steve Jobs having a lot to do with Apple, but some of the innovations in terms of the graphical user interface and other things that got Apple started many years ago came about because of something called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which still exists today. So Apple was built in part because of basic research that was funded by the federal government. Google, anybody care to guess where Google got its start other than Stanford dorm rooms? From a grant from the National Science Foundation. And these stories often are told in a way to sort of make government the hero. I don't know if it's necessary to go that far, but it's important to understand that a lot of these innovations come from research funded at the university level. When I, now more than 20 years ago, worked on Capitol Hill for Jake Pickle, I think Ali mentioned that in the introduction. Jake Pickle represented Austin, Texas for more than 30 years, and Austin is now known as a tech hub. A good bit of that came about because of a lot of federal funds that Pickle helped bring to the University of Texas. Some of it had to do with the establishment of a government-funded consortium in the 1980s called Sematech, which helped build manufacturing technology to manufacture semiconductor chips. So the government typically and traditionally has had a very strong role in seeding innovation through grants, typically to university professors and their grad students. So you have examples that are contemporary, Apple and Google getting their starts in part because of government R&D investment. Go back farther into time, computers, the Defense Department was initially the main customer for computers, which helped develop that industry. Semiconductors as well, the semiconductor chips that make your computers run faster and faster. So we see that broadband policy has, in my view, an enduring public dimension to it. That has to do with the nature of broadband itself, with broadband being an information network, broadband increasingly becoming key infrastructure for our daily lives, and the fact that there's a regulatory tradition in history that it just isn't going to go away overnight. So where is policy today with broadband? As I said at the top, I worked on the National Broadband Plan, which we started work on that in 2009, released it now, I think 3.5 years ago in March of 2010. The broadband plan itself is a blueprint for what government agencies and the nation should do to further develop broadband. So there are a whole host of recommendations in the broadband plan that go essentially to the FCC. I mentioned a couple of them having to do with spectrum and incentive auctions. A key one also goes to the area that I worked on principally, which is broadband adoption, and that recommendation is to reform the Lifeline Link-Up program, which currently subsidizes access to telephone service for low-income people, to adapt it and expand it so that it can be used to help get broadband, help low-income people get broadband service at home. So the plan itself has a bunch of specific recommendations that have helped frame action in areas such as spectrum and broadband adoption policy. An important third part of the National Broadband Plan, and the three parts of the plan were promoting broadband adoption, promoting better and faster networks for Americans. The third part we called national purposes. And that section of the broadband plan really goes to recommendations that break outside of the traditional regulatory box that broadband policy has been in. So the national purposes, just to list some of the topics, included healthcare, civic engagement, environmental protection. I always forget a few. But these were recommendations that went to trying to answer the question, broadband, what for? And for instance, as we stand today in the area of telemedicine and healthcare delivery, there is increasingly the expectation when you go to your doctor that you as a patient have access to the internet. I mean, how many times have you all gone to the doctor and the doctor hands you a sheet with a bunch of links on it to suggest you go home and check out this information pertaining to the diagnosis? It happens very commonly. So there's an expectation among providers these days that patients have access to the internet. Lots of patients have become much more empowered with their interactions with their healthcare providers by coming armed essentially with lots of information from the web. A colleague of mine, a former colleague at the Pew Internet Project, Susanna Fox, who focuses a lot on healthcare, says that she's learned that there's signals that doctors give to each other typically, and this is an anecdote of 3 or 4 years ago. Doctors would go do something like this and then look at a patient. And this meant this patient has lots of information from the World Wide Web, so be prepared to answer a lot of questions. So there's the expectation that that patients have access. More importantly, as we have higher speed networks, more ubiquitous networks, healthcare providers are starting to do telemedicine, have expectations about monitoring healthcare at home. If we want to reap the fruits of all those innovations, both in the marketplace for profitability and importantly for more efficient and effective delivery of government services, we're going to have people connected to very high-speed networks. So broadband is breaking out of the bounds of issues in Washington, at least, that only the FCC or the Commerce Department cares about, and becoming something that agencies such as HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, and and the Education Department care about. So broadband is going to be important for those reasons as well. And then 2 final points. The issue of big data and privacy will make broadband and telecom policy important for a good bit of time going forward. As each of us does more and more online, we, whether we know it or not, share more data with either providers or the government. That data can be very profitable to the private sector. It can be very helpful in terms of figuring out how to tailor specific services to specific individuals or kinds of individuals, but they raise the issue of privacy and either big brother or big business looking over people's shoulders. People will continue to be concerned about that. My former colleagues at the Pew Internet Project just within the past day or so released a survey that goes to the level of worry that a lot of people have about sharing information online. So the government will have to work with the private sector to develop frameworks to ensure for people that their data is safe and secure. The final thing that the National Broadband Plan did that I think was both very important and hard to measure is really spark interest in broadband at the state and local level around the country. Part of that was by design of the stimulus bill in 2009 that funded investments at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the Commerce Department. That legislation set up 50 state broadband initiatives whose principal function is to map broadband networks in their states so that there's greater transparency for the public about the nature of broadband networks in their states or communities. But having set up these entities have become really focal points for discussion at the state and local level on what broadband means to a region or a regional economy. That has been an absolutely wonderful, halfway intended consequence of the National Broadband Plan to get people in states very interested in broadband. And I know from my conversations with the folks in Arkansas, Arkansas is doing very smart things at this point in time to try to increase broadband adoption. I will say also the other element that helped spark a lot of interest in broadband at the state and local level was Google, with its Google's Fiber to Communities contest that will give away a broadband network to winning communities. Google started that contest in 2010. I don't think they had any clear expectations as to how many communities would apply when they did the competition first in 2010, but over 1,100 communities applied for Google's Fiber to the Communities project. I guess two, at the time it was just one, Kansas City won. Subsequently, Provo, Utah, and Austin, Texas have also become the beneficiaries of Google's largesse. But between the broadband plan, NTIA's SB, state broadband initiatives, and the Google Fiber contest, you had this incredible coalescing or catalytic event, series of events occurring that got states and communities very interested in how to use broadband to further various social and economic goals. And again, in Arkansas, which has traditionally trailed other states in a lot of metrics when it comes to broadband, it's very heartening to me to talk to people like Marie Bruno and others, and Emerson Evans in Arkansas, to see how Arkansas is playing catch up, seeing results of some of those efforts, and doing some really smart things to try to understand not only how to improve deployment of networks throughout the state, but to increase broadband adoption. So with that, I will conclude, and happy to take questions or have a more extended conversation on these issues. Thank you all very much.
We do have time for some questions. Raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Governor Tucker? Here it comes. 1 second.
Thank you very much for an excellent overview of that. That was just terrific. To the extent you have any knowledge on it, I was curious what, if any, possible movement forward there might be with the use of laser technology for broadband transmission.
Wow, very technical. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge based on the specifics of laser technology. So, sorry.
Gordon, right here, bro.
Yeah, Gordon Apple with Ed for You. I just downloaded the UN report. It just came out in the last day or two, and your numbers seem a little optimistic. I mean, on this fixed band broadband penetration, in the United States it claims about 28%.
Yep.
And we're ranked number 20th. Now, that's on wired internet. On wireless phones and stuff, we're up about rated number 9, I think. But I don't know. I personally see the situation being much worse than a lot of the numbers I hear from the government about penetration. And for one thing, school systems, for example, in Arkansas have about a 2 kilobit per second average per student.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they're trying to get it up to maybe 8 or 10 kilobits per second. It's pretty pathetic. And what we consider broadband, the way a lot of the measurement is like, I don't know what they're doing today, maybe a megabit. Used to be less than that, like 700 kilobits. But what we really want to see is the 50 and 100 megabit per second rates, like a lot of the rest of the world has. And we're not anywhere near that. I mean, my UVerse gets up to 20, but that's the highest you can get in this town that I know of. Mm-hmm. You know, how are we going to get this whole thing out there and get everybody elevated up to where we've got something more like the, let's say, the Utopia system out along the I-15 corridor, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it goes to a favorite topic of Blair Levin, who was the director of the National Broadband Plan. Has anybody here heard of gig.u? that specific initiative? One or two heads nodding. The issue you're raising is essentially, are we doing well enough relative to other nations? On broadband adoption, the data shows we're sort of middle of the pack. On wireless use, we rate much better. On network speeds, we're at best middle of the pack. The question then becomes, how do we incent investment to get us to the next level? And in DC these days, the phrase gigabit challenge is thrown around quite a bit. So for instance, Google in Kansas City, soon in Provo, in Austin, will provide fiber to people's homes, which will enable gigabit transmission of internet to people's homes. Cable is getting ever more speed out of the cable plant using DOCSIS 3 and other innovations. So the question, though, is, which you're touching on, is how do we sort of jumpstart the network investment or network upgrade conversation? And that's a real knotty question for policymakers in DC at this point for two reasons. One is you do have the carriers saying that really our networks are good and fine, so we don't need upgrades. You also have carriers making the good point that we don't know what consumers would do with all this extra speed if we were to invest in it. So if we invest in this gigabit network that a lot of people talk about, we're not certain that there are going to be enough uses for it to justify that investment. That, though, becomes a chicken and egg problem, because if you don't have the network capacity built out, then you don't have the incentives in place for developers, whether they're the people making the next whiz-bang telemedicine innovation, or the people really thinking about how to use internet in the educational system, K through 12. They don't have the capacity to spark their imagination to develop those applications that will in fact use all that capacity. So it is a difficult chicken and egg problem. The solution thus far has been test beds, meaning let's try to encourage Google to do test beds in places like Kansas City or Austin or Provo. The Gig.U project, which is run by Blair Levin, tries to spur interest in cities to make the investment proposition for the private sector to build gigabit networks more attractive. And Blair has managed to get some cities like Seattle, Chicago, a few others, to start to make movement toward that kind of investment. But there's no national strategy on this. To your point about schools in Arkansas, the E-rate program, which is a multi-billion-dollar program set up in 1996 to get internet connectivity to schools in the United States, is in the process of being reformed by the FCC under the banner of President Obama's Connected Ed initiative. That's going to take time to get, A, to do the reforms, and then B, to get the kind of infrastructure into schools so that you have the ability to do one-to-one connectivity for students, meaning that each student on a connected device has sufficient capacity to carry out various educational applications. Other questions?
Yes, sir.
I think that young man.
Yeah.
And then I just do this.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice talk. I was curious about the considerations for reliability and resilience for some of these broadband networks and information networks, especially in disaster-related situations and disaster management. And for example, in Sandy's superstorm, where we had most of the broadband networks and cell phone networks break down while the landline were still running. So what were some of the initiatives in Advanced Internet Access Program to handle these considerations?
So you're talking about public safety applications. Yeah, one recommendation of the broadband plan was to have the creation of a national interoperable wireless broadband network for public safety. And currently, the process is underway in the Commerce Department to roll out what's called FirstNet, which will be that national public safety network. And that is actually being funded in part through proceeds from the incentive auctions that I described earlier. So when the government does auction off spectrum that broadcasters essentially give back to the government for commercial purposes, a portion of the proceeds from those auctions, as I said, some of them will go back to broadcasters, but something like $10 billion of that will go to the development of FirstNet, which will take a couple of years to get online, but that is the initiative that is aimed at having a network in place that could withstand disasters, but more importantly, not just hardened enough to withstand disasters. I mean, natural disasters will, I think, inevitably create disruptions in networks, but just to have a network in place so that when there's a large public emergency, first responders can respond. So FirstNet is that initiative.
Last one.
Could you speak a little bit about, demographically speaking, the demographic factors, the age race that factors into how Americans are using the internet, and if you have anything specific to our Arkansas area as well, that would be.
Sure. I will go to my cheat sheets on data, and this will be national data, but the groups that have the lowest home broadband penetration rates are senior citizens, people over the age of 65. Just about 50% of, 43% of seniors have broadband at home. Poor Americans, low-income Americans, understandably, have lower rates of broadband adoption, just over half. Those with less education, people with less than high school education, just 37%, or roughly half the national average, have broadband at home. Also, with lower than average broadband adoption rates are Hispanics and African Americans, who incidentally overperform in terms of adoption of smartphones and those sorts of devices. But basically, if you're trying to imagine the typical person who doesn't have broadband at home, it's more than likely to be a senior citizen, someone who has low income or low educational attainment. And some of the initiatives that have sprung up that I didn't really have a chance to talk about over the past couple of years are aimed at trying to tailor broadband adoption initiatives to specific demographic areas, essentially trying to meet people where they are.
Well, thank you all for coming out. John, thank you so much for visiting the Clinton School, and we hope to see you all at the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you all.